The rules of court shall govern the procedure to be observed in actions, civil or criminal, and special proceedings. A civil action is one by which a party sues another for the enforcement or protection of a right, or the prevention or redress of a wrong. A civil action may either be ordinary or special. Both are governed by the rules for ordinary civil actions, subject to the specific rules prescribed for a special civil action. Okay, so there are two types of civil action. It could be ordinary civil action or special civil action. An ordinary civil action is defined in the same way that a party sues another for the enforcement or protection of a right or the prevention or redress of a wrong. Every ordinary civil action must be based on a cause of action. A special civil action is also governed by the rules for ordinary civil actions, but subject to specific rules prescribed for special civil actions. So let us distinguish between ordinary civil action versus special civil action. Let's discuss the case of DBM versus Manila's Finest Retirees Association, GR number 169466, May 9, 2007. The facts in this case are as follows. Respondents filed a petition for declaratory relief against DBM and other government agencies, alleging that the Integrated National Police, or INP retirees, were equally situated as the PNP retirees, but whose retirement benefits were unconscionably and arbitrarily accepted from the higher rates and adjusted benefits accorded to the PNP retirees. They prayed that declaratory judgment be rendered in their favor, declaring that they are truly absorbed and equally considered as PNP retirees, and thus entitled to the same or identical retirement benefits under the PNP law or RA number 6795 as amended. The case was docketed as a civil case in the RTC. So the RTC granted the petition and held that the INP retirees were entitled to the same or identical retirement benefits. The Court of Appeals affirmed the trial court's decision. Opposing the respondents' entitlement to the retirement benefits, the petitioners fault the trial court for ordering the immediate adjustments of the respondents' retirement benefits when the basic petition filed before it was one for declaratory relief, a special civil action. To the petitioners, such petition does not essentially entail an executory process, the only relief proper under that setting being a declaration of the parties' rights and duties. The issue in this case is whether or not execution can be ordered in a declaratory relief. What do you think? The Supreme Court held that the execution of judgments in a petition for declaratory relief is not necessarily indefensible. It cited a case wherein the Supreme Court affirmed the order for the petitioners therein to pay the balance of the deposit insurance to therein respondents, and the court explained in that case that there is nothing in the nature of a special civil action for declaratory relief that prescribes the filing of a counterclaim based on the same transaction, deed, or contract subject of the complaint. A special civil action is, after all, not essentially different from an ordinary civil action, which is generally governed by Rules 1 to 56 of the Rules of Court, except that the former deals with a special subject matter which makes necessary some special regulation. But the identity between their fundamental nature is such that the same rules governing ordinary civil suits may and do apply to special civil actions, if not inconsistent with, or if they may serve to supplement the provisions of the peculiar rules governing special civil actions. Okay? Similarly, the Supreme Court cited another case where it held that under Section 6 of Rule 64, the action for declaratory relief may be converted into an ordinary action, and the parties allowed to file such pleadings as may be necessary or proper if before the final determination of the case, a breach or violation of an ordinance should take place. The Supreme Court held that it sees no reason for treating the present case differently from the previously cited cases. This disposition becomes all the more appropriate considering that the respondents, as petitioners in the RTC, pleaded for the immediate adjustment of their retirement benefits, which significantly the herein petitioners, as respondents in the same court, did not object to. Okay? Being aware of said prayer, the petitioners then already knew the logical consequence if, as it turned out, a declaratory judgment is rendered in the respondent's favor. So the Supreme Court was trying to say that just because a declaratory relief is a special civil action doesn't mean that there is no remedy under the ordinary rules that can be used against an order or a judgment made under the case. However, the petitioners in this case failed to do so. The Supreme Court held that at the bottom then, the trial court's judgment forestalled multiplicity of suits which, needless distress, would only entail a long and arduous process. Considering the obvious advance years of the respondents, they can hardly afford another protracted proceedings. It is thus for the Supreme Court to already write finis to the case. Special proceeding. It is a remedy by which a party seeks to establish a status, a right, or a particular fact. So how is it different from a civil action? In civil action, generally, it is adversarial in nature. There are parties, such as the plaintiff versus the defendants. On the other hand, special proceeding, generally no definite adverse party, since it is directed against the whole world, mostly in rem actions. Civil action is to protect and enforce a right or prevent or redress a wrong, whereas special proceeding is to establish a right, status, or fact. Civil action is governed by ordinary rules supplemented by special rules, whereas special proceeding is governed by special rules supplemented by ordinary rules. Civil action is heard by courts of general jurisdiction, whereas special proceedings are usually heard by courts of limited jurisdiction. Civil action is initiated by a pleading and parties respond through an answer after being served with summons. So that's the usual process. Whereas in special proceeding, it is initiated by means of, let's say, a petition, and parties respond by means of an opposition after notice and publication are made. Parties are generally allowed to file answer, counterclaim, cross-claim, and third-party complaint in civil action, whereas in special proceeding, parties or the law on pleadings generally are not applicable. In civil action, the period to appeal is only 15 days and notice of appeal suffices, whereas in special proceeding, the period to appeal is 30 days, and aside from a notice of appeal, a record on appeal is usually required. Okay, ordinary civil action versus special proceeding. Let us illustrate. The case of Natcher versus Court of Appeals, GR number 133000, October 2, 2001. So the issue in this case is, may a regional trial court, acting as a court of general jurisdiction in an action for reconveyance and annulment of title with damages, adjudicate matters relating to the settlement of the estate of a deceased person, particularly in questions as to advancement of property made by the decedent to any of the heirs. The Supreme Court held that there lies a marked distinction between an action and a special proceeding. An action is a formal demand of one's right in a court of justice in the manner prescribed by the court or by the law. It is the method of applying legal remedies according to definite established rules. The term special proceeding may be defined as an application or proceeding to establish the status or right of a party or a particular fact. Usually, in special proceedings, no formal pleadings are required unless the statute expressly so provides. In special proceedings, the remedy is granted generally upon an application or motion. The court further held that Citing American jurisprudence, a noted authority in remedial law expounds further that it may accordingly be stated generally that actions include those proceedings which are instituted and prosecuted according to the ordinary rules and provisions relating to actions at law or suits in equity, and that special proceedings include those proceedings which are not ordinary in this sense, but is instituted and prosecuted according to some special mode, as in the case of proceedings commenced without summons and prosecuted without regular pleadings, which are characteristics of ordinary actions. A special proceeding must therefore be in the nature of a distinct and independent proceeding for particular relief, such as may be instituted independently of a pending action by petition or motion upon notice. Okay, so the Supreme Court held that applying these principles, an action for reconveyance and annulment of title with damages is a civil action, whereas matters relating to settlement of the estate of a deceased person, such as advancement of property made by the decedent, partake of the nature of a special proceeding, which concomitantly requires the application of specific rules as provided for in the rules of court. Clearly, matters which involve settlement and distribution of the estate of the decedent fall within the exclusive province of the probate court in the exercise of its limited jurisdiction. Corollarily, the regional trial court in the instant case, acting in its general jurisdiction, is devoid of authority to render an adjudication and resolve the issue of advancement of the real property in favor of the herein petitioner that nature, inasmuch as the civil case for reconveyance and annulment of title with damages is not, to our mind, the proper vehicle to thresh out said question. Moreover, under the present circumstances, the RTC of Manila, Branch 55, was not properly constituted as a probate court so as to validly pass upon the question of advancement made by the decedent Del Rosario to his wife, herein petitioner, nature. Okay, next case. Heirs of Doronio versus Heirs of Doronio, GR number 169454, December 27, 2007. The issue in this case is whether issues and impairment of legitim can be threshed out in an action for reconveyance and damages. The Supreme Court held that issues and impairment of legitim should be threshed out in a special proceeding, not in civil action for reconveyance and damages. Petitioners are correct in alleging that the issue regarding the impairment of legitim of Fortunato Doronio must be resolved in an action for the settlement of estates of spouses Simeon Doronio and Cornelia Gante. It may not be passed upon in an action for reconveyance and damages. A probate court, in the exercise of its limited jurisdiction, is the best forum to ventilate and adjudge the issue of impairment of legitim, as well as other related matters involving the settlement of the estate. An action for reconveyance with damages is a civil action, whereas matters relating to settlement of the estate of a deceased person, such as advancement of property made by the decedent, partake of the nature of a special proceeding. Special proceedings require the application of specific rules as provided for in the rules of court. The Supreme Court held that before any conclusion about the legal share due to a compulsory heir may be reached, it is necessary that certain steps be taken first. The net estate of the decedent must be ascertained by deducting all payable obligations and charges from the value of the property owned by the deceased at the time of his death. Then, all donations subject to collation would be added to it. With the partible estate thus determined, the legitim of the compulsory heir or heirs can be established, and only then can it be ascertained whether or not a donation had prejudiced the legitims. Next case, Heirs of Gabatan versus Court of Appeals, GR number 150206, March 13, 2009. The facts in this case are as follows. A lot in Kalinugan, Balulang, Cagayan de Oro City was declared for taxation in the name of Juan Gabatan. In the complaint before the RTC, respondent alleged that she is the sole owner of the lot, having inherited it from her deceased mother, Hermogena, whom she alleged to be the only child of Juan Gabatan. Petitioners denied that respondent's mother was the daughter of Juan Gabatan. Petitioners maintained that Juan Gabatan died single and without any issue and was survived by siblings, their predecessor in interest. The RTC rendered a decision declaring the respondent the owner of the lot. The Court of Appeals affirmed the decision. So the issue in this case is whether the court can determine the legal heirs of the deceased. The Supreme Court explained that jurisprudence dictates that the determination of who are the legal heirs of the deceased must be made in the proper special proceedings in court and not in an ordinary suit for recovery of ownership and possession of property. This must take precedence over the action for recovery of possession and ownership. The court has consistently ruled that the trial court cannot make a declaration of heirship in the civil action for the reason that such a declaration can only be made in a special proceeding. Under Section 3, Rule 1 of the 1997 Revised Rules of Court, a civil action is defined as one by which a party sues another for the enforcement or protection of a right or the prevention or redress of a wrong, while a special proceeding is a remedy by which a party seeks to establish a status, a right, or a particular fact. It is then decisively clear that the declaration of heirship can be made only in a special proceeding, inasmuch as the petitioners here are seeking the establishment of a status or right. In the early case of Litam et al. Versus Rivera, the Supreme Court ruled that the declaration of heirship must be made in a special proceeding again and not in an independent civil action. In the more recent case of Milagros Joaquino versus Lourdes Reyes, the Supreme Court reiterated its ruling that matters relating to the rights of filiation and heirship must be ventilated in the proper probate court in a special proceeding instituted precisely for the purpose of determining such rights. Citing the case of Agapay versus Palang, the court held that the status of an illegitimate child who claimed to be an heir to a decedent's estate could not be adjudicated in an ordinary civil action, which, as in this case, was for the recovery of property. Is there an exception to this rule? The Supreme Court held that we are not unmindful of the decision in Portugal versus Portugal Beltran, where the court relaxed its rule and allowed the trial court in a proceeding for annulment of title to determine the status of the party therein as heirs. The Supreme Court held in that case that it appearing, however, that in the present case the only property of the intestate estate of Portugal is the Caloocan parcel of land, to still subject it, under the circumstances of the case, to a special proceeding, which could be long, hence, not expeditious, just to establish the status of petitioners as heirs, is not only impractical, it is burdensome to the estate with the costs and expenses of an administration proceeding. And it is superfluous in light of the fact that the parties to the civil case, subject to the present case, could and had already in fact presented evidence before the trial court which assumed jurisdiction over the case upon the issues it defined during pre-trial. So in the case of Portugal, the court held that in fine, under the circumstances of the present case, there being no compelling reason to still subject Portugal's estate to administration proceedings, since a determination of petitioners' status as heirs could be achieved in the civil case filed by petitioners. Okay? The trial court should proceed to evaluate the evidence presented by the parties during the trial and render a decision thereon upon the issues it defined during the pre-trial. Take note, in this case, there is only one property that is involved. The Supreme Court held in this case of heirs of Gabatan versus Court of Appeals that similarly in the present case, there appears to be only one parcel of land being claimed by the contending parties as their inheritance from Juan Gabatan. It would be more practical to dispense with a separate special proceeding for the determination of the status of respondent as the sole heir of Juan Gabatan, especially in light of the fact that the parties to the civil case had voluntarily submitted the issue to the RTC and already presented their evidence regarding the issue of heirship in these proceedings. Also, the RTC assumed jurisdiction over the same and consequently rendered judgment thereon. Next case, Ching versus Rodriguez, GR number 192828, November 28, 2011. The facts in this case are as follows. Respondents filed a complaint captioned as 1-4, disinheritance, declaration of nullity of agreement and waiver, affidavit of extrajudicial settlement, deed of absolute sale, TCT with prayer for the issuance of TRO, and writ of preliminary injunction. It was docketed as an ordinary civil action. Petitioners filed a motion to dismiss, but it was denied. Petitioners subsequently filed another motion to dismiss to the amended complaint, alleging that the declaration of the heirs and propriety of the disinheritance partakes of a special proceeding and not an ordinary action for declaration of nullity. Hence, jurisdiction pertains to a probate court or intestate court and not the RTC acting as an ordinary court. The issue in this case is whether the matters in the case can only be resolved in a special proceeding and not in an ordinary civil action. The petitioners argue that only a probate court has the authority to determine who are the heirs of a decedent, the validity of a waiver of hereditary rights, the status of each heir, and whether the property in the inventory is conjugal or the exclusive property of the deceased spouse. Further, the extent of the decedent's estate, the status of the contending parties, and the respondent's alleged entitlement as heirs to receive the proceeds of Antonio CPPA now in Metrobank's custody are matters which are more appropriately the subject of a special proceeding and not of an ordinary civil action. So these are the arguments of the petitioners. The Supreme Court held that under Article 916 of the New Civil Code, disinheritance can be effected only through a will wherein the legal cause therefore shall be specified. The court agrees with the RTC and the CA that while the respondents in their complaint, the amended complaint, sought the disinheritance of Ramon, no will or any instrument supposedly effecting the disposition of Antonio's estate was ever mentioned. Hence, despite the prayer for Ramon's disinheritance, Civil Case number 02-105251 does not partake of the nature of a special proceeding and does not call for the probate court's exercise of its limited jurisdiction. The Supreme Court held that in sum, the court agrees with the Court of Appeals that the nullification of the document subject of the civil case could be achieved in an ordinary civil action, which in this specific case was instituted to protect the respondents from the supposedly fraudulent acts of Ramon. In the event that the RTC will find grounds to grant the reliefs prayed for by the respondents, the only consequence will be the reversion of the properties subject of the dispute to the estate of Antonio. The civil case was not instituted to conclusively resolve the issues relating to the administration, liquidation, and distribution of Antonio's estate, hence not the proper subject of a special proceeding for the settlement of the estate of a deceased person under Rule 73 to 91 of the Rules of Court. Further, the Supreme Court held that the respondent's resort to an ordinary civil action before the RTC may not be strategically sound, because the settlement proceeding should thereafter still follow, if their intent is to recover from Ramon the properties alleged to have been illegally transferred in his name. Well, be that as it may, the RTC in the exercise of its general jurisdiction cannot be restrained from taking cognizance of respondent's complaint, an amended complaint, as the issues raised and the prayers indicated therein are matters which need not be threshed out in a special proceeding. Okay, so take note the difference that if the action requires the determination of the entire estate of the deceased, then necessarily it requires a special proceeding. But if the action, for example, is an annulment of title, or part of the action can still fall under the general jurisdiction of the RTC, then it cannot be restrained from taking cognizance of the action. And the issues raised and the prayers indicated are matters which need not be threshed out in a special proceeding. We are done talking about civil action and special proceeding. Now, what is a criminal action? A criminal action is one by which the state prosecutes a person for an act or omission punishable by law. Okay, criminal procedure is pertinently discussed in its specific section in this module.